Hi. Hi. Just waiting for people to join. Hi, Taro. It's good to see you. So, if you don't see my face, it's because my ring light stopped working. Okay, I don't know if anybody else is joining anywhere else, so let's begin. This is part 3 of chapter 1. And so far we have delved into the scope of Orientalism. So now we're looking at it as a project. And it is indeed a colonial project. Hi, Tapley. Good to see you. Hi, Doc. And it really is a colonial project because we're looking at Orientalism as not just a study or an area of study, but the area in which people in the West, by which people in the West define the Orient, as opposed to the Occident, which is the West. So, part 3, chapter 1. Yeah, Taro, I quite like it. It is necessary to examine the more flamboyant operational successes of Orientalism, if only to judge how exactly wrong and how totally opposite to the truth was the grandly menacing idea expressed by Michelet that the Orient advances, invincible, fatal to the gods of light, and by the charm of its streams, by the magic of its chiaroscuro. Cultural, material, and intellectual relations between Europe and the Orient have gone through innumerable phases. Even though the line between East and West made a certain constant impression upon Europe, yet, in general, it was the West that moved upon the East, not vice versa. And it's important to know that. When we talk about Israel and we say every accusation is a confession, we can say the same of everybody in the West. We can say the same of every single power that has come out of the West. Hi, Everett. Good to see you. we see how the West has projected itself upon the global majority, saying, oh no, we don't do this, you do this. They take what is ours and label it as theirs, and they take what is theirs and they push it onto us. Funny that. Orientalism is the generic term that I have been employing to describe the Western approach to the Orient, the discipline by which the Orient was and is approached systematically as a topic of learning, discovery, and practice. But in addition, I have been using the word to designate that collection of dreams, images, and vocabularies available to anyone who has tried to talk about what lies east of the dividing line. Hi, comrade. Welcome in. These two aspects of Orientalism are not incongruent, since by use of them, both Europe could advance securely and unmetaphorically upon the Orient. So, physically advancing in a secure fashion, knowing that they have the full backing, the manufactured consent of their people, of their governments, of their media behind them. Sounds familiar, no? So that they can securely advance in those ways, but also unmetaphorically. They wanted to advance physically into the East. Not to steal spices, but to take control of the spice trade, to take control of trade routes, to take control of textiles, to take control over the means of production. And this is something that I need to write down. We see here in Orientalism how the West has taken control of narratives. In How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney, we see how Europe took over not just trade, but Europe took over entire methods of production, entire industries, shutting down, systematically shutting down each of the industries that Africa had engaged in, like producing copper pots, creating textiles, clay work. Europe halted, not just halted, it interrupted and then halted Africa's Iron Age, and then had the audacity to say that Africa is backwards. It's wild. And then goes on to say that the workers owning the means of production is not that important. I need to flesh out this idea a little bit more. And their advance was for control, entirely for control. Here I should like principally to consider material evidence of this advance. Islam accepted, the Orient for Europe was, until the 19th century, a domain with a continuous history of unchallenged Western dominance. This is patently true of the British experience in India, the Portuguese experience in the East Indies, China, and Japan, and the French and Italian experiences in various regions of the Orient. There were occasional instances of native intransigence to disturb the idyll, as when in 1638 to 1639, a group of Japanese Christians threw the Portuguese out of the area, by and large. However, only the Arab and Islamic Orient presented Europe with an unresolved challenge on the political, intellectual, and for a time economic level. For much of its history, then, Orientalism carries with it the stamp of the problematic European attitude towards Islam, and this is acutely sensitive aspect of Orientalism, around which my interest in the study turns. Doubtless, Islam was a real provocation in many ways, lying uneasily close to Christianity geographically and culturally, drawing on the Judeo-Hellenic traditions, borrowing creatively from Christianity. It could boast of unrivaled military and political success. Nor was this all. The Islamic lands sit adjacent the Islamic lands sit adjacent to and even on top of the biblical lands. Moreover, the heart of the Islamic domain has always been the region closest to Europe, what has been called the Near Orient or Near East. Arabic and Hebrew are Semitic languages, and together they dispose and redispose of material that is urgently important to Christianity. From the end of the 7th century until the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, Islam in its either Arab, Ottoman, or North African and Spanish form dominated or effectively threatened European Christianity. And of course, we can't have that, can we? You okay? Uh-huh. Yeah, that's cool. Thank you so much. You have been a lifesaver today. Yeah, it's fine. Don't worry, I got it. Thank you so much. From the end of the 7th century, that Islam has outstripped and outshone Rome cannot have been absent from the mind of any European, past or present. Oh, it's JW here. Hey, JW. Even Gibbon was no exception, as is evident in the following passage from The Decline and Fall. In the victorious days of the Roman Republic, it had been the aim of the Senate to confine their councils and legions to a single war, and to completely suppress the first enemy before provoking the hostilities of a second. I mean, that was just Europe in a nutshell. Like, hey, let's finish one more first and then go to the next. And then Napoleon came along. These timid maxims of policy were disdained with the magnanimity or enthusiasm of the Arabian caliphs. With the same vigor and success, they invaded the successors of Augustus and Artaxerxes, and the rival monarchies at the same instant became the prey of an enemy whom they had so long been accustomed to despise. In the 10 years of the administration of Omar, the Saracens reduced his obedience, 36,000 cities or castles destroyed, 4,000 churches or temples of the unbelievers, and edified 1,400 mosques for the exercise of the religion of Muhammad. 100 years after his flight from Mecca, the arms of reign and of his successors extended from India to the Atlantic Ocean over various and distant provinces. Hi everyone, welcome in. We are reading part 3 of chapter 1 of Orientalism. Artaxerxes, yes, Artaxerxes. When I read names that I've only heard pronounced, I have a problem reading it. And when I have a word that when I hear a word that I've only ever seen in print, I have trouble with it. So colonialism was all about taking control and the means of getting capital, but the workers gaining the means of production would be bad. Exactly. Because the owners, the workers gaining the means of production meant that the owners got nothing. But the idea of owning the means of production came from the fact that the West completely eradicated a global South industry and replaced it instead with trade on their terms. When the term Orient was not simply a synonym for the Asiatic East as a whole, or taken as generally denoting the distant and exotic, it was most rigorously understood as applying to the Islamic Orient. This militant Orient came to stand for what Henri Baudet has called the Asiatic tidal wave. Certainly, this was the case in Europe through the middle of the 18th century, the point at which repositories of Oriental knowledge like Der Bibliothek stopped meaning primarily Islam, the Arabs, or Ottomans. No, no, no. Please don't. The more I learn, the better equipped I am to teach. Please never stop teaching me. Yes, it is capitalist protectionist propaganda. It absolutely is. Until that time, cultural memory gave understandable prominence to relatively distant events as the fall of Constantinople, the Crusades, the conquest of Sicily and Spain. But if these signified the menacing Orient, they did not at the same time efface what remained of Asia. Every time I read or hear the name Constantinople, you know what I think. Istanbul was Constantinople, now it's Istanbul, not Constantinople. I should stop. For there was always India, where, after Portugal pioneered the first basis of European presence in the early 16th century, Europe, and primarily England after a long period from about 1600 to 1758, of essential commercial activity, dominated politically as an occupying force. Yet India itself never provided an indigenous threat to Europe. Rather, it was because native authority crumbled and opened the land to inter-European rivalry and to outright European political control that the Indian Orient could be treated by Europe with such propriety, hauteur, never with the sense of danger reserved for Islam. I have said it before that one of the reasons that India could not be Christianized is because Hinduism was written. They valued the written word a lot more. And it's also one of the reasons that Islam was never squashed as cultures and religions and oral traditions were. It's antithetical to what an echo chamber is, but if I am to be in one... How do you know that? Yes, I love that. Oh, I absolutely love that. But Hinduism never posed the threat that Islam does because it was so far removed from the closeness that Islam has to Christianity. It's like step 3 of a 12-step program to healing from monotheistic trauma. I don't know. Thanks for the follow, Hannah. Nevertheless, between this hauteur and anything accurate, positive knowledge, there existed a vast disparity. Der Belot's entries for Indo-Persian subjects in the Bibliothèque were all based on Islamic sources, and it's true to say that until the early 19th century, Oriental languages were considered a synonym for Semitic languages. The Oriental Renaissance, which Quinet spoke, served the function of expanding some fairly narrow limits, in which Islam was the catch-all Orient example. When people say Orient, they usually think Muslim. They think, what's the tales that Scheherazade told? Arabian Nights. They think Aladdin, which is actually pronounced Aladdin. Not Aladdin. And Jasmine would be pronounced Yasmin as a name, not jasmine as in the herb and the flower and the rice. Um, no, it's Yasmin. Um, yeah, that is what is conjured when we mention the word Orient, because the Far East was seen as Oriental, but not a threat. It's one of the reasons that Arabic is not considered a Semitic language by the West, because that would include them if there was anti Semitic hate, which there is. Sanskrit, Indian religion, and Indian history did not acquire the status of scientific knowledge after Sir William Jones's effort in the late 18th century, and even Jones's interest in India came to him by way of his prior interest and knowledge of Islam. What did you grow up associating the word Orient with? Because Taro here says, I grew up associating the Orient with Asian culture before sociological lenses. Mm. It was, yeah. So what did you associate it with? It's not surprising then that the first major work of Oriental scholarship after the Bibliothèque was Simon Ockley's History of the Saracens, whose first volume appeared in 1708. A recent historian of Orientalism has opined that Ockley's attitude towards Muslims, that to them is owed what was first known of philosophy by European Christians, shocked painfully his European audience. For not only did Ockley make this Islamic preeminence clear in his work, he also gave Europe its first authentic and substantial taste of the Arab viewpoint, touching the wars with Byzantium and Persia. However, Ockley was careful to dissociate himself from the infectious influence of Islam, and unlike his colleague William Whiston, Newton's successor at Cambridge, he always made it clear that Islam was an outrageous heresy. For his Islamic enthusiasm, on the other hand, Whiston was expelled from Cambridge in 1709. Knowledge is always gatekept. The ivory tower is not our ally. Access to Indian or Oriental riches had always been made by first crossing the Islamic provinces and by withstanding the dangerous effect of Islam as a system of quasi-Aryan belief. And at least for the larger segment of the 18th century, Britain and France were successful. The Ottoman Empire had long since settled into a, for Europe, comfortable, I cannot pronounce this word, senescence, to be inscribed in the 19th century as the Eastern Question. Britain and France fought each other in India between 1744 and 1748, and again between 1756 and 1763, until, in 1769, the British emerged in practical and economic and political control of the subcontinent, and there they looted pretty much their entire legacy. The reason Britain is so rich is because of India. The reason Britain has NHS is because of India. The reason Britain has everything it has is because of India. What was more inevitable than that Napoleon should choose to harass Britain's Oriental Empire by first intercepting its Islamic throughway? Egypt. The prime reason I need to educate myself. I can see the problem, but I don't have the theory or language to back up my opinion. That's exactly why readings like this are so important. Although it was almost immediately preceded by at least two major Orientalist projects, Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798 and his foray into Syria have had by far the greatest consequence for the modern history of Orientalism. Before Napoleon, only two efforts, both by scholars, had been made to invade the Orient by stripping it of its veils and by going beyond the comparative shelter of the biblical Orient. The first was by Abraham Hyacinthe and Tequil du Perron, 1731 to 1805, an eccentric theoretician of egalitarianism, a man who managed in his head to reconcile Jansenism with Orthodox Catholicism and Brahmanism, and who traveled to Asia in order to prove the actual primitive existence of a chosen people and biblical genealogies. Motherfucker. Or as we would say in Hindi, mother chot. Hi, Aaron. One of my favorite human beings. I miss you. Instead, he overshot his early goal and traveled as far as Surat, there to find a cache of Avestan text, there also to complete his translation of the Avesta. Raymond Schwab has said of the mysterious Avestan fragment and that set Antiquil off on his voyages, whereas the scholars looked at the famous fragment of Oxford and returned to their studies, Antiquil looked and went to India. Schwab also remarks that Antiquil and Voltaire, though temperamentally and ideologically at hopeless odds with each other, had a similar interest in the Orient and Bible. The one to make the Bible more indisputable, the other to make it more unbelievable. Ironically, Anquetil's Avesta translations served Voltaire's purposes, since Anquetil's discoveries soon led to criticism of the very biblical texts which had hitherto been considered to be revealed. The net effect of Anquetil's expedition is well described by Schwab here. In 1759, Anquetil finished his translation of the Avesta at Surat, and 1786 that of the Upanishads in Paris. He had dug a channel between the hemispheres of human genius, correcting and expanding the old humanism of the Mediterranean basin. Less than 50 years earlier, his compatriots were asked what it was like to be Persian when he taught them how to compare the monuments of the Persians to those of the Greeks. Before him, one looked for information on the remote past of our planet exclusively among the great Latin, Greek, Jewish, and Arabic writers. The Bible was regarded as a lonely rock, an aerolite. A universe in writing was available, but scarcely anyone seemed to suspect the immensity of those unknown lands. The realization began with the translation of the Avesta and reached dizzying heights owing to the exploration in Central Asia of the languages that multiplied after Babel. Into our schools, up to that time limited to the narrow Greco-Latin heritage of the Renaissance, of which much had been transmitted to Europe by Islam, he interjected a vision of innumerable civilizations from ages past, an infinity of literatures. Moreover, the few European provinces were not the only places to have left their mark on history. I think I need to read Schwab. I've never read any of Schwab's work. I mean, hi Raven, it's good to see you. How pathetic and sad it is to think that you're the only ones on earth. I'm sorry. Hello, bad puppy. Yeah, the page rubbing sound. Sorry, I'm Fidgety. What was I saying? Yeah, how pathetic it is to assume that you're the only ones on earth who actually know how to do a certain thing, can actually read, write, produce anything. How sad and pitiful to not consider other human beings. Hello, Cole. For the first time, the Orient was revealed to Europe in the materiality of texts, languages, and civilizations. Also, for the first time, Asia acquired a precise intellectual and historical dimension with which to buttress the myths of its geographic distance and vastness. By one of those inevitable contracting compensations for a sudden cultural expansion, Anquetil's Oriental labours were succeeded by William Jones's, the second of the pre-Napoleonic projects I mentioned above. Whereas Anquetil opened large vistas, Jones closed them down, codifying, tabulating, comparing. Before he left England for India in 1783, Jones was already a master of Arabic, Hebrew, and Persian. These seemed perhaps the least of his accomplishments. He was also a poet, jurist, polyhistor, a classicist, and an supremacism, yeah. Absolutely. Fuck, I hate this word. Indefatigable scholar whose powers would recommend him to such as Benjamin Franklin, Edmund Burke, William Pitt, and Samuel Johnson. In due course, he was appointed to an honourable and profitable place in the Indies, and immediately upon his arrival there, to take up post with the East India Company. Oop. Come on. Wait. This sentence does not make sense. And immediately upon his arrival there to take up a post with the East India Company, yes, comma, began the course of personal study that was to gather in, to rope off, and to domesticate the Orient, and thereby turn it into a province of European learning. For his personal work, titled Objects of Inquiry During My Residence in Asia, he enumerated my geography of Hindustan, best mode of governing Bengal, arithmetic and geometry, and mixed sciences of the Asiatics, medicine, chemistry, sugary, and anatomy of the Indians, natural productions of India, poetry, rhetoric, and morality of Asia, music of the Eastern nations, trade, manufacture, agriculture, and commerce of India, and so on and so forth. On August 17, 1787, he wrote unassumingly to Lord Althorp that it is my ambition to know India better than any other European could ever know it. Here is where Balfour in 1910 could find the first adumbration of his claims as an Englishman to know the Orient more and better than anyone else. Thank you. Jones's official work was the law, an occupation with symbolic significances for history of Orientalism. 7 years before Jones arrived in India, Warren Hastings decided that Indians were to be ruled by their own laws, a more enterprising project than it appears at first glance, since the Sanskrit code of laws existed then for practical use only, in a Persian translation, and no Englishman at the time knew Sanskrit well enough to consult the original texts. A company official, Charles Wilkins, first mastered Sanskrit, then began to translate the Institutes of Manu, and his labour was soon assisted by Jones. Wilkins, incidentally, was the first translator of the Bhagavad Gita, one of the holy books. In January 1784, Jones convened the inaugural meeting of the Asiatic Society of Bengal, which was to be for India what the Royal Society was for England. As first president of the society as a magistrate, Jones acquired the effective knowledge of the Orient and Orientals that was later to make him the undisputed founder, the phrase is A.J. Arbery's, of Orientalism. To rule and learn, and to compare Orient with Occident, were Jones's goals, which with an irresistible impulse always to codify, to subdue the infinite variety of the Orient to a complete digest of laws, figures, customs, and works, he believed he had achieved it. His most famous pronouncement indicates the extent to which modern Orientalism, even its philosophical beginnings, was a comparative discipline having for its principal goal the grounding of European languages in a distant, harmless Oriental source. Yeah. This is why, as Frantz Fanon said, we cannot extricate ourselves from whiteness. We're stuck. We're stuck in whiteness. We're stuck in relation to whiteness. Jones said, "The Sanskrit language, whatever be its antiquity, is of a wonderful structure, more perfect than Greek, more copious than Latin, and more exquisitely refined than either, yet bearing to both of them a stronger affinity, both in the roots of verbs and the forms of grammar, than could possibly have been produced by accident. So strong indeed that no philologer could examine them all three without believing them to have sprung from some common source." Of course, that's where Indo-European comes from. Thank you so much. And they had to insert themselves, right? Because there's no way an Eastern language could have come from brown people. Because it's too complex. Wait until they read ancient Arabic texts. Jeez. Many of the early English Orientalists in India were, like Jones, legal scholars, or else, interestingly enough, medical men with strong missionary leanings. No, there were other people coming in and out. But yeah, I think after you got busy, the tapping stopped. That's fine. I mean, whoever's here is here. So far as one can tell, most of them were imbued with the dual purpose of investigating the sciences and arts of Asia, with the hope of facilitating ameliorations and advancing knowledge, improving the arts at home. So the common Orientalist goal was stated in the centenary volume of the Royal Asiatic Society, founded in 1823 by Henry Thomas Colebrook. In their dealings with modern Orientals, the early professional Orientalists like Jones, who had only two roles to fulfill, we cannot today fault them for strictures placed on humanity by the official Occidental character and their presence in the Orient. They were either judges or doctors. Even Edgar Quinet, writing more metaphysically than realistically, was dimly aware of his therapeutic relationship, the Asia of the prophets, the genus of religions, the Europe of doctors. Proper acknowledging of the Orient proceeded from a thorough study of the classical texts, and only after that to an application of those texts to the modern. Faced with the obvious decrepitude and political impotence of the modern Oriental, the European Orientalist found it his duty to rescue some portion of a lost past classical Oriental grandeur, to facilitate ameliorations in the present Orient. They just wanted to keep things as they thought of it, because You know, the romanticized version is so much prettier. No room to grow, no room to advance, and absolutely no room to assert its own place in the world. What the European took from the classical Oriental past was a vision, and of course thousands of facts and artifacts, which he could only employ to the best advantage to the modern Oriental he gave facilitation and amelioration, and two, the benefit of his judgment as to what was best for the modern Orient. Because, like, oh no, you can't do that. We don't like it. I might be outing myself, and this question might not be apt here, but is there a difference between cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation? Yes, there is a difference between appropriation and appreciation. And let's see. Oh, this chapter is so long. I'll explain it in a little bit. It was characteristic of all Orientalist projects before Napoleon's that very little could be done in advance of the project to prepare it for its success. Anquetil and Jones, for example, learned that what they did about the Orient only after they got there. They were confronting, as it were, the whole Orient, and only after a while, after considerable improvising, could they whittle it down to a smaller province. Napoleon, on the other hand, wanted nothing less than to take the whole of Egypt, and his advanced preparations were of unparalleled magnitude and thoroughness. Even so, these preparations were almost fanatically schematic, and, if I may use the word, textual, which are features which will bear some analysis here. Three things above all else seem to have been in Napoleon's mind as he readied himself while in Italy in 1797 for his next military move. First, aside from the still threatening power of England, his military success that had culminated in the Treaty of Campo Formio left him no other place to turn for additional glory than the East. Napoleon, man. The fuck. I can safely say that Napoleon was the Trump of his time. Abso-fucking-lutely. Moreover, Talleyrand had recently just use simple words, Edward. Adverted on less advantageous I'm trying to translate the French here. Les avantages héréditaires des colonies nouvelles dans les circonstances présentes. Retirer. The advantages of leaving the new colonies, considering the present circumstances. Yeah, he really was. Like, look, I'm smart. Yay. And this notion, along with the appealing prospect of hurting Britain, drew him eastwards. Secondly, Napoleon had been attracted to the Orient since his adolescence. His youthful manuscripts, for example, containing a summary he made for Marigny's Histoire des Arabes, and is evident from all of his writing and conversation that he was steeped, as Jean Thierry put it, in the memories and glories that were attached to Alexander's Orient, generally, and to Egypt in particular. Thus the idea of conquering Egypt as a new Alexander proposed itself to him, allied with the additional benefit of acquiring a new Islamic colony at England's expense. Thirdly, Napoleon considered Egypt a likely project precisely because he knew it tactically, strategically, historically, and, not to be underestimated, textually, That is something one read about and knew through writings of recent as well as classical European authorities. The point in all this is that for Napoleon, Egypt was a project that acquired reality in his mind, and later, in his preparations for conquest, through experiences that belonged to the realm of ideas and myths culled from texts, not reality. His plans for Egypt thus became the first in a long series of European encounters with the Orient, in which the Orientalist special expertise was put directly to functional colonial use. For at the crucial instant, when an Orientalist had to decide whether his loyalties and sympathies lay with the Orient or with the conquering West, he always chooses the latter. He stole all schematics and texts and burnt what he couldn't take. Exactly. Yeah. That's exactly it. Bad animal. As for the emperor himself, he saw the Orient only as it had been encoded first by classical texts and then by Orientalist experts, whose vision, based on classical texts, seemed a useful substitute for any actual encounter with the real Orient. Like, no, we don't actually need to encounter these people. We don't need to talk to them. We don't need to interview them. We don't need to actually hear their side of the story because fuck them because they're brown. Amira! And the puzzle piece comes up. Why are you giving me pictures of birds? I hate birds. Napoleon's enlistment of several dozen savants for his Egyptian expedition is too well known to require detail here. His idea was to build a sort of living archive for the expedition. Yeah, that whole savages they don't deserve. Amira, great minds. Because birds are devil dinosaurs. Yeah, the whole idea of they're savages, they don't know what's good for themselves. We know, because we're civilized. They're the ones that brutally conquered, brutally raped, murdered, and colonized lands and decimated entire villages, cultures, languages. And they call us uncivilized. His idea was to build a sort of living archive for the expedition in the form of studies conducted on all topics by members of the Institute of Egypt, which he founded. What is perhaps less well known is Napoleon's prior reliance upon the work of Comte de Volney, a French traveller whose Voyages of Syria and Egypt appeared in 2 volumes in 1787. Aside from a short personal preface informing the reader that the sudden acquisition of some money, his inheritance, made it possible for him to take the trip east in 1783, Volney's Voyage is almost oppressively an impersonal document. Volney evidently saw himself as a scientist whose job it always is to record the state of something he saw. The climax of the Voyage occurs in the 2nd volume, an account of Islam as a religion, the first time it was mentioned as such. And as a system of political institutions. Volney's views were canonically hostile to Islam as a religion and as a system of political institutions. Nevertheless, Napoleon found his work in Volney's Considération of particular importance from 1788, the Considération. The full name is the Considerations of the Turkish War. For Volney, after all, was a canny Frenchman. And like Chateaubriand and Lamartine, a quarter century after him, he eyed the Near Orient as a likely place for the realization of French colonial ambition. What Napoleon profited from in Volney was enumeration, an ascending order of difficulty, the obstacles to be faced in the Orient by any expeditionary force. Napoleon refers explicitly to Volney in his reflections in the Egyptian expeditions. The Campagne d'Égypte et les Syries from 1798 to 1799, which he dictated to the General Bertrand on St. Helena. Volney, he said, considered that there were three barriers to French hegemony in the Orient, and that any French force would therefore have to fight three wars: one against England, the second against the Ottoman Portes, and the third, the most difficult, against Muslims. Volney's assessment was both shrewd and hard to fault, since it was clear to Napoleon, as it would be to anyone who read Volney, that his Voyage and Considération were effective texts to be used by any European wishing to win in the Orient. In other words, Volney's work constituted a handbook for attenuating the human shock a European might feel as he directly experienced the Orient. Reading the book seems to have been Volney's thesis, and far from being disorientated by the Orient, I will compel it to you. Napoleon took Volney almost literally, but in a characteristic, subtle way. I like that. From the first moment that the army of Egypt appeared on the Egyptian horizon, every effort was made to convince the Muslims that "Nous sommes les vrais musulmans," as Bonaparte's proclamation of July 2nd, 1798 put it to the people of Alexandria. We are the real Muslims. Devil dinosaurs, yes. Who ate people? Oh, all conquering white people ate indigenous people at some point or the other. Are you laughing at devil dinosaurs? Equipped with the team of Orientalists and sitting on the boarded flagship called the Orient, Napoleon used Egyptian enmity towards the Mamelukes and appeals to the revolutionary idea of equal opportunity for all to wage a uniquely benign and selective war against Islam. Oh yeah, in the Americas, both North and South, in Africa, in pretty much every fucking where except Antarctica. Oh, at the French, yeah. But the song remains the same, right? We are the real Canaanites. Say people who get skin cancer when they step out into the sun in the Middle East. Yes, everywhere except Antarctica. There's evidence of colonizers, white colonizers, eating indigenous people. That animal I fucking adore you. Don't be sorry. That just made my night. And I do want to add something before I move from Napoleon. Oh God, he goes on about Napoleon for a very, very long time. What more than anything impressed the first Arab consigliere of the expedition, Abd al-Rahman al-Jabarti, was Napoleon's use of scholars to manage his contracts with natives and the impact of watching modern European intellectual establishments at close quarters. Napoleon tried everywhere to prove that he was fighting for Islam. Everything he said was translated into Quranic Arabic, just as the French army was urged by its command always to remember Islamic sensibilities. Compare in this regard Napoleon's tactics in Egypt with the tactics of the Requerimiento, a document drawn up in 1513 in Spanish by the Spaniards to be read aloud to the Indians. We shall take you, your wives, and your children, and make slaves of them, and as such sell and dispose of them as their Highness the King and Queen of Spain may command. And we shall take away your goods, and we shall do with you all the mischief and damage that we can. And as to vassals who do not obey, etc., etc. And when it seemed obvious to Napoleon that his force was too small to impose itself on the Egyptians, he tried to make the local imams, qadis, muftis, and ulemas interpret the Quran in favor of the Grand Army. To this end, the 60 imams who taught at the Azhar were invited to his quarters, given full military honors, and allowed to be flattered by Napoleon's admiration for Islam and Muhammad, peace be upon him, and by his obvious veneration for the Quran, which he seemed perfectly familiar. It worked, and soon the population of Cairo seemed to have lost its distrust of its occupiers. Napoleon later gave his deputy Kleber strict instructions after he left always to administer Egypt through the Orientalist and religious Islamic leaders whom they could win over. Any other politics was too expensive and foolish. Hugo thought that he grasped the tactful glory of Napoleon's Oriental expedition in his poem Louis. By the Nile I find him once again, Egypt shines with the fire of its dawn. His imperial orb rises in the Orient. Victor, enthusiast, bursting with achievements, prodigious, stunned the land of prodigies. The old sheikhs venerated the young and prudent emir. The people dreaded his unprecedented arms. Sublime he appeared in dazzled tribes, like Muhammad of the Occident. If you can't win them militarily, you win them through religion, ideologically. And there is where I will stop for today. Any questions? Right. Exiting. There. Infiltrate, divide, conquer. Exactly. That's exactly how it works. So, Bad Animal, I need to hop on a VC with you and you need to teach me how to use Twitch because I am completely very silly when it comes to doing things like this. Anyway, the difference between cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation. Yes, thank you for reminding me, Tara. Appreciation is when you don't take it. You are appreciating its beauty either from afar or being invited to do so from the inside. So when you go to a prayer that you are invited to by a person who is Hindu and they place a tilak on your forehead, or like, the thingy here, they bestow that upon you as members of that religion, members of that community. When you are invited to watch or participate in a practice by the Maori people of Aotearoa, They could tell you, hey, come up and we'll teach you a haka. That is appreciation. Or when you sit on the sidelines and try to understand it, know its origins, know its story, know what it means, and still stay where you are instead of saying, I've seen this now, I can take it. That is appreciation. Appropriation is when you have a culture in front of you, where you have close practices that are incredibly spiritual, religious, or incredibly important to those people. And you say, fuck it, I don't care what it means, I'm just taking it. And that is what happens with colonization. They look at pretty things that they want to take. Like how in the US, white women want to braid their hair. They fight so hard for braiding their hair in box braids. And white Americans fight so hard to maintain the right to use AAVE and say the N-word in rap songs when they're singing along. But they don't want black people. They want our curries and our dosas and our roti and naan. And they want our fabrics and our bindis. But they will fight tooth and nail to deport Indian people living in their apartment block and will call ICE on them. They want to cannibalize our cultures and discard our bodies. That's exactly it, bad animal. They want what we have, not what we are. And then when they suddenly have that thing, they sell it back to us at a premium while saying we're not allowed to do it. Look up the material, the textile called chintz. It is a material, the textile that was invented in India. A lot of the Gori Memsabs of the colonizers loved it. It was banned in India. Production then moved to Scotland. And chintz, which originated in India, was sold back to the Indians at prices they could not afford. That is appropriation. When a white person does henna, does not acknowledge where it comes from, and does in no part of that business does it benefit the people that henna, which is actually called mendi, comes from. That is appropriation. We're allowed to refine our oil. We must sell it raw to France, so they refine it and sell it back. Yeah. That's exactly what Walter Rodney was talking about when he said halting the means of production. Halting and interrupting the means of production. Okay. See, firstly, calling it dreads is a no. That is a racist term for it. You call it locks because of its history. And secondly, tarot, honestly, I would take them off. I would shave my head. As soon as I learnt about it, I would shave it and just regrow. But that's just me. But I'm not the one who should be telling you what to do. Alrighty, I am going to lurk on the TikTok streets. Remember, I do have a Patreon. If you can subscribe to it, if you can afford to, it is $1, $5, $10, or $20 a month, depending on the tier that you choose. And I also have a Tiki-Talkie, which I'm on here, The Unscripted Revolution, on YouTube, on Twitch, and I have a Discord if you want to join. It is all in my in my link tree. And yeah, remember to drink water, eat something, take your meds. Remember to smash the motherfucking patriarchy, eat all the white men. And if you don't eat meat, compost them, because I hear they make really good compost. And remember to be kind, especially to yourselves, because everybody deserves kindness, including you. And I encourage you, with how I'm feeling today especially, go out and punch your local Nazi. Thank you so much, Tarot. I'll see you around. I shall see you all tomorrow. Same time, different book. Bye.